Where Trump sets ceasefire for Russo-Ukrainian War. When President Trump speaks of a ceasefire, the world stops and listens. But where will he set the ceasefire line? On this issue, as early as April, May and June 2022, Yi Chichuan clearly proposed three theoretical ceasefire lines. He believes that, from a historical perspective, the L1 line is in the long-term interests of both the United States and Russia. If the US coalition forces can push Russia back to the L2 line, the ceasefire line established on the L2 line will also be relatively stable. The third ceasefire line is the ceasefire line established somewhere between the L1 line and the L2 line. This ceasefire line is unstable. This means that the United States has a political plan to use the situation in Ukraine to intervene in Europe for a long time. Yi Chichuan made his crazy prediction only 2, 3, and 4 months after the war started. He believes that the ceasefire line must be drawn taking into account the political plan of the US. At the same time, the pursuit of interests by both the US and Russia must be taken into account. Of course, if China wants to get involved, it will also become an important variable. Other relevant parties, including Ukraine, Europe as a whole and Ukraine's neighbors, can all be ignored. I apologize to the Europeans for my rudeness. I believe my conclusion has caused them considerable frustration. But politics is so much crueler and more realistic. If Europe is still considered one of the three great political powers, it is the one that is already in decline. And it is clearly the one that will continue to decline. So when considering the proposal for a ceasefire line, Europe should basically be ignored. Even if Europe is taken into account a little, it is either pretended or paid for. It now appears that the Russians are currently unable to reach the L1 line. Even Yi Chichuan's crazy predictions for 2022 and 2023 can only be described as long-term. He only dared to say that the probability of the Russians reaching the L1 line was close to 100% over a period of 100 years. So why did he insist on the possibility of the L1 line becoming the ceasefire line? Because a ceasefire on the L1 line best meets the requirements for a long-term ceasefire. It is the most economically optimal solution for maintaining a long-term ceasefire. And economic issues are the basis for solving all political and military issues. A ceasefire on the L2 line seems completely unrealistic at the moment. But the truth is that it would be impossible to write a book on the possibilities, complexities, evolutionary paths, political struggles, etc. of a ceasefire on the L2 line. All of Shakespeare's works about war put together are not as exciting as the play about a truce on the L2 line. Let's ignore this part today because of the difficulty of the subject. It seems that only the reality of a truce between L1 and L2 remains. In his article of 2022, Yi Chichuan already affirmed the fact that a ceasefire between L1 and L2 is the easiest option to achieve. He called this truce plan a truce on L3. He pointed out that a ceasefire at L3 is not stable. The cost of achieving this truce is minimal. The cost of breaking it is also very low. A truce on the L3 line means that several shareholders are jointly building a political investment bank. When a political strongman needs political support, he opens this bank and manipulates it. Any relevant party can restart the war as soon as they need political capital. Then they can gain political benefits through war operations or subsequent ceasefires. Yi Chichuan always views current events from a historical perspective. The ceasefire on the L3 line is in the best interest of the United States' long-term plan to interfere in Europe. It is also in the interests of Europe's political strongmen to benefit from the ceasefire and the war. Russia, on the other hand, will face long-term military, political and economic pressure. In order to resist long-term pressure from the United States and Europe, Russia will establish about 7 local autonomous governments on Ukrainian land as an effective means of resistance, quoted from Yi Chichuan's 2022 prophecy. Appendix: the Yugoslavization of Ukraine, referring to being literally and physically dismembered into several parts. The Somalization of Ukraine, referring to being literally part of Ukraine but physically divided into several small pieces. Ukraine's enemies and allies today are both the main factors contributing to the division of Ukraine. This is the fate of Ukraine. It is also the fate of Europe.